Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Common Table. I am your host today. My name is Natanya Escote. Thank you for joining the conversation for the people, for the planet, and for the common green. So today our guest is Dr. Jonathan Cybulksi. He is a historical ecologist and science communicator and has been involved with a lot of different universities. And so to make sure that I do not actually miss anything, I will pass it to you. And so go for it.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me in the introduction. Yep. John Cybulski. I am currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute out of Panama. I am formally and still doing research with the University of Hong Kong, which is where most of my stories lie and where I was living for 6 years and where I did my PhD. I think I just said that. I'm currently in Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry, where I'm analyzing a bunch of coral fossils from Panama. And I'm also a research affiliate with the University of Rhode Island, the Graduate School of Oceanography in the United States. So, a couple different unimportant titles, but importantly, studying coral reefs and currently in Germany.
Right. On that note, I actually I didn't know that you were there to focus and study on the coral reefs from Panama.
Yeah, yes.
So why is it that you'd have to go all the way to Germany?
Yeah, no, I'm a historical ecologist, which means I look at ecosystem changes through time. So I like to tell people that I tell the story of an ecosystem through the last several thousand years into the present. The way you tell that story is where you get into the nitty-gritty details of science, right? So one is just analyzing the fossils. So taxonomically, so I look at coral pieces and I identify what coral it is. So I know what was there, what was not there. You can look at taphonomy, which is the preservation of that fossil, because believe it or not, how well something has been preserved will tell you different things about the environment around it at the time of death or since then. But then what I primarily do and what I really love, but is a mouthful to bring up at parties, is I do stable isotope geochemistry. So this is looking at different isotopes, so different elements in their elemental composition and in different proportions. And we can use these elements as fingerprints to past processes. So primarily I look at nitrogen and oxygen, and these are elements that are integrated into a coral skeleton when it's growing. The coral dies, the skeleton's left behind, that becomes a fossil. It gets buried, I collect it. And then if I look at the nitrogen and the oxygen in that fossil, it will tell me a snapshot at that point in time of what was going on for that coral. And very generally speaking, nitrogen tells you something about the nutrients, so the surrounding food availability for that coral. And the oxygen tells you something about climate. So it's linked to sea surface temperature, and you can link it to climate. So why am I in Germany, which is your question 5 minutes ago? Because Panama is where I do a lot of the research and where I've collected a lot of these corals and where my questions lie. The Max Planck Institute for Chemistry, where I'm at right now, is one of the best labs in the world for the method that I'm using to analyze these skeletons. So I can't do it in Panama. There's a bunch of, I wish I could walk you around the lab. The Wi-Fi would cut out. There's a bunch of like crazy fancy machines that look like we're going to space. And they do these incredible analyses. And this is one of the best places to do what I do. So I was lucky enough to get invited here.
Okay. That's really interesting. Right. Yeah. And you also mentioned that you did 6 years in Hong Kong and primarily focused on corals. Now, I'm from Macau and Hong Kong. I've been based here my whole life. And like I mentioned earlier, we've never spoken about corals. And here in Macau, we have one beach. And in English, it literally translates to black sand beach. It's basically dead. I think it's dead. And half of the time I don't go there because it's just, it does look and smell dead. So to imagine a colorful, full of life type of marine, ecosystem is really bizarre for me. And so how did you pick or know about or find any interest in going into Hong Kong to focus on coral reefs?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the question, right? And like I told you before the call, you've taken my only fun party line, which is, I'm in Hong Kong. I'm like, did you know that there are coral reefs in Hong Kong? Everyone's like, what? It's pretty great. But in all seriousness, I mean, I don't know how many talks I've given over the years while at Hong Kong, and every talk, a handful of people there who grew up in Hong Kong had no idea, had no clue that corals were living in Hong Kong's waters, and thought the same thing, like, how could they possibly be here? You'd look at Victoria Harbor, etc. And so then I always get this question, why the hell are you here, John? You came from the U.S. all the way to Hong Kong to study coral. And the short answer, because as you can tell, everything's long with me, is the reason I came to Hong Kong was kind of threefold. One was I really liked the lab that I came into. So I was part of Dr. David Baker's lab, who's a coral ecologist. And he had built an incredible community, which to me is the most important part of doing science. So that attracted me. The university is a great institution internationally. That also attracted me. But then the science. So I've always known there was coral in Hong Kong because when I was introduced to Hong Kong, I was introduced by coral people, and I was like, boom, this is so cool. And then you look at a map, and I'm like, wait a second, there's 5 times as many people in Hong Kong as Manhattan.
Yeah.
But there's coral here. And if you look a little bit deeper, then you have the Pearl River to the west, in between us and Macau. And then you have this oceanic water to the east where all the corals live. And you have this incredible experiment set up. You have this water quality gradient. You have this biodiversity gradient. And for me, I was like, this is paradise. I mean, this is an incredible experience. And I felt very lucky to come study them because, the truth, I almost said sad, but it's really not. It's just the fact is most coral reefs in the world, all of them are impacted by humans in one way or another. Most of them are moving towards an urban reef, right? I mean, you think of all the coastal cities that are popping up, all the development.
Yeah.
I think Dave, my old supervisor, was the one who coined this term where Hong Kong may represent coral reefs of the future, right? So what reefs are going to look like in a lot of different areas that are becoming more urbanized, that are becoming more polluted, that have more people living right on top of them. Think the Philippines, Indonesia, Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So all of those reasons just made it such a fascinating story. And I was like, I have this incredible opportunity to go look at them. And no one had asked any historical questions about the reefs. And that's what I do. So so I was excited to come. Yeah, it was like, boom. Okay. Also, I was super excited to get out of the U.S. Not enough people do that. So I was ready. I was like, let's explore a little bit.
One of the papers that you also helped write, I was scrolling through it because you've written a lot, and this happens to be one of the more popular ones. It was named Coral Reef Diversity Losses in China's Greater Bay Area were driven by regional stressors. And so is it mostly caused by humans? So that's what we've noticed, right? It's more and more because of anthropogenic reasons and sources. So I can imagine, I mean, here, pollution rate and all that stuff, is it as simple as that? It's we suck as humans, and so that's really reflecting onto the marine, or is it much more complex and something we don't know here?
No, it's always more complex. Okay. Ecology is a simple word that we use to try and define the environment, which is impossible, right? So many things play. But in a simple way simpler way to look at it is, okay, all corals, which are animals, or coral reefs, the habitat around the world, are influenced by humans. Full stop. We know this. And usually that impact is not great. And generally, I like to think of it as 3 levels of impact. There's global, which is what everybody knows because it's climate change, right? So I would say most people know about coral reefs, at least in the newspapers, because of coral bleaching, or thermal bleaching, right? And this is, everyone's seen the pictures, they turn white, a lot of them die, Great Barrier Reef, etc. This is a global impact because we're emitting carbon, it's changing the Earth's climate, in a lot of places it's raising temperatures. So this is impacting reefs around the world, more or less in different areas, but we have global. A step down from that is regional impacts. So these are things that are happening, like for Hong Kong, water quality coming from the Pearl River, right? Because that's the region of China. And then Hong Kong itself regionally, is like dumping or wastewater runoff. So those are kind of like a regional influence. And then there's local. And local is overfishing, right, in this reef. It's dynamite fishing. So you're removing and killing the coral, right? So there's kind of these three levels of impact. And my question and my story for Hong Kong was really, which one is the greatest influence now or has been historically? Because if there's a large question when it comes to conservation and restoration on where to put your money.
Yes.
And if you can identify what is impacting or what is stressing this ecosystem at this time the most, we can focus conservation there. Now, this is even a controversial topic because some people think we should just put all our money into climate change because we need to curb that. I argued in my paper that for places like Hong Kong, up until now, climate hasn't been a huge influence. It's been all regional water quality, which is very poor. Right. And the historical side of it is in like the 60s to the 80s, it was overfished. And there was a lot of local influences that were really bad. So that local regional combination is really what's driven the reefs of Hong Kong today to be where they're at. And this is a similar story actually for Singapore. Macau's reefs or corals were destroyed a long time ago because there's now casinos on them. But yeah,
I mean, I live on land that did not exist. Half a century ago. Yeah, so definitely, the impact of that. Yeah. So when you were talking about how the dynamite fishing and the fishing practices that happened in Hong Kong decades ago, was the effect of it immediate, or it took decades for you to also notice or come to life?
So in my eyes, I consider local impacts almost more immediate because they tend to impact the animal directly. So I'm talking like dynamite fishing, you just blew a coral reef up, right? Yeah. If you overfish the fish for sustenance, I mean, you're removing part of that ecosystem so you can see it right away. Whereas something like water quality is maybe it degrades over time and you can't track it as much. Now, I'm not the first person to come to Hong Kong and be like, there was some bad things happening to the marine environment here. I bet you it had an impact. I think ecological monitoring in Hong Kong really started in like the 1980s. So people knew about this, right? But no one had done a systematic approach that I did for collecting the fossils. And I went back thousands of years to try to piece together everything to really show that, surprisingly to me, as of 100 years ago, the corals in Hong Kong were widespread. They covered twice as much area as they do now, and they were pretty much homogeneous. So they looked all the same no matter where you were in Hong Kong, as opposed to today where they're kind of scrunched up in a smaller area with really clean water quality. And we've lost a lot of the diversity, so we've lost certain types of coral in certain areas of Hong Kong, mostly driven by this water quality. Did the, decades of overfishing, the land reclamation, and actually there was this thing called coral mining, which happened in Hong Kong and around the Asian coast, which is where so it's where you take some source of carbonate, which is, can be coral, can be shells, can be rock, and you crush it and burn it and you turn it into slake lime, which is that white paste that you would paint a house with or you would mortar bricks with. In Hong Kong, there is no carbonate geology, so the only place they were getting it from was the oceans. So they were actually dredging up corals and oysters to use as source material for this lime. So all of those all play together to impact the reefs as well.
Right.
Today, my conclusion was that, I mean, all of those already happened. Now we also have this poor water quality on top of it, and that's the driving force.
Right. Yeah, and I honestly don't. Yeah, yeah. It just reminds me of how when you were on the Nat Geo, the Planet Possible Day, that little thing. There was this one thing that was mentioned by Gagan Anand, the progressive Indian chef, and he said something about how the spending culture and practices that are happening, and this is definitely something that I think a lot of my listeners in Macau and a lot of the people that you've encountered in Hong Kong will notice, is that the spending, especially in food as well, is insane. And so a lot of us do not hold back, and I think it's really that privilege and a lot of that income that goes into that, and that has a direct impact as well with the kind of our relationship with marine life. Do you think that there is a realistic way that us as consumers can actually play a part, with doing a better job?
Yeah, of course. I think consumers, which maybe everyone is more or less, or at least in very affluent areas, are the driving force that has to make the change, right? Yeah. I feel like a lot of the conversation. Let me step back for a sec. So I was involved a little bit in like climate policy in a previous life during my master's, and I worked for the government. And a lot of like climate policy was always this discussion between developed and developing countries. Okay. And it's like we have to help developing countries develop more green and more sustainably, right? Because now we know that burning coal is bad. I'm just using example.
Yeah.
Which is totally true. But a huge part of it also is, if we're a developed, affluent country, we need to clean ourselves up. Maybe we use more green energy, but capitalism and consumerism is a huge problem, and generates a lot of waste. And I completely think that it would start with consumers, right? Making smarter choices from every aspect. I mean, that event you were talking about, we were talking about food, and I am not a food expert, but they asked me to speak because I'm trying to be more sustainable with my diet, which for me is the hardest part. These clothes I'm wearing are like 10 years old, so I feel good about that. But like what I eat, I'm also trying to clean up. But from every aspect of it, everything that we do, even the little changes are going to have large impacts. Yes.
Of course. Yeah. And so whenever I have these conversations as well, there's that response or that counter response where, though we can do a lot as consumers, especially consumers from affluent areas and from with affluent pockets, you're still kind of bound, and you still have to work within the systems that you're put in. And so the governmental policies that you're also having to live, you have to live and abide by. And in Hong Kong and here in Macau, at least, I can say that you are kind of pushed and encouraged and supported to keep pursuing those affluent practices, and if you can afford it, go afford it and buy it and enjoy it. And so I think that is also really difficult, like ensuring that the environment and the policies also encourage consumers to also play their part. So governments also have to play their part. And so how and as we've noticed, the land reclamation has been picked over the corals basically this whole time. And so how do you think the governments in the ASEAN area, or at least in Hong Kong or Greater Bay, has been responding to their impact, the city's impact?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I think there's no argument that should it be, top-down government, or should it be grassroots, bottom-up, consumers first? It has to be both.
Definitely, yeah.
And I mean, I'm a huge proponent of, you have to control what you can control, right? I mean, yes, it would be ideal if all governments had a very sustainable outlook and were making policies that were in line with the earth, but they're not. But we can't use that as an excuse on an individual level, both for how you're able to sleep at night with yourself, you know, and also your actual commitment to the earth. So I think as an individual, that grassroots movement, it's needed to be a global citizen. But also, and I'm not an economist, I'm not a sociologist, but a lot of political change comes from the voice of the people, right? And it comes from swings and movements from grassroots that cause these changes. And so, yes, cities, Hong Kong, Macau are flashing consumerism, New York, all these big places. Doesn't mean you have to abide by it. It does make it easier. And it's hard. I mean, I think this is the thing that I struggle with the most, is how hard it is to be sustainable and to make good choices, and whether or not we can allow that to be an excuse for us if we have the opportunity to do that, right? And I use it as an excuse all the time. Like, man, it's so easy to get all the protein I need from meat. Like, I should just eat meat. But really, it's not supposed to be easy to do the right thing. I mean, it doesn't have to be. So, yeah. And to answer your question, I think a bit more directly, Hong Kong, okay, if we take water quality, has made huge strides. So the water quality in the 90s in Hong Kong was bad, real bad, particularly in certain areas. We're talking like almost toxic waste. They built a couple more wastewater treatment plants. The AFCD, which is the Agricultural and Fisheries Conservation Department, was heavily involved working with the marine life, and they have been progressing to improve water quality, and water quality has improved. And that has, as a very personal example, because some areas it's improved, that's what's allowed other members of my lab to do a lot of the coral restoration work that they've done, because they felt they could bring the coral back and the coral wouldn't just die again. From a larger perspective, and I'll speak about kind of only what I know because I'm not a political expert either, but you know, China is, a couple of years ago, they declared war on pollution, and they're making huge strides with air pollution and renewables. I believe China is the leading country in the world as far as alternative energies.
Yes.
They're also burning a lot of coal, but they're also I think they're making strides. As I'm sure you do, and most of your listeners probably represent a huge bias towards which way we should be leaning, as far as sustainable or economic or consumerism. But I'm not completely disappointed. And I think that obviously improvements can be had, but I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of went on a tangent there. I do that a lot. I think that's what happens when they're complex situations. And I think where you led on towards the end is how nuanced it actually is. And so, and that is the situation we've noticed very clearly with China. It's like leading with the renewables, but it's as if it just cancels out the opposite action. Yeah. So no, definitely. And I think what you're saying about a lot of the change that happens at higher up levels, like with governments and policies, most of the time is pushed and really aggravated by the public or those that speak up. And so I think on that note, I did want to ask about how, like, on your website, and as I've seen with the TedX talks and everything, there's a lot of storytelling. A lot of you talk about conservation storytelling, and so maybe you could share a little bit about why you do that and. The heart behind that. Yeah, I mean, I think, where do I begin with this? I simply put, growing up, I still do, but especially growing up, like I love reading. And I only read epic fantasy novels. I'm talking like Lord of the Rings is like light of what I read. I get in the weeds. And that was not the nonfiction E.O. Wilson path. I thought that was going to go towards. Oh, no. I was like, I'm reading dragons. Okay. I get enough nonfiction in my everyday life. Give me wizards. But this is going somewhere, I promise. But like what I found is, what did I really love? What made me care about those stories? And it was the characters. and you get really invested in those individual characters and their individual stories. So when I got into science and became a scientist, I approached my communication in a very similar way. And it was, what's going to get people to care about coral reefs? Yeah, I'm sure if we give them the big picture about how everyone's dying and how the environment is degrading in this global scale, maybe that worked. Yes. I don't think it's worked so far.
Yeah.
But to me, it was about creating these. It was about creating these characters. It was about creating these stories that people could actually relate to, and that's why I fell in love with historical ecology, because it's literally my job to piece together a story of an environment through time, however I choose to do that. But I collect data and I put all this stuff together, and I get to be part ecologist and archaeologist and geologist and I really craft the details of that story in a way that people can appreciate. And that aspect of it to me is both what I enjoy, but also you kind of want to, I hope that many people want to do something with their life that they feel is meaningful. And I think I'm pretty good at it. And I think that's what I can give back to science, is this way of approaching it and this way of understanding often bad, but definitely complex situations in this kind of storytelling format. Because I think science or scientists has been limited or inaccessible over the years because scientists tend to to use really big words and keep their data really close and keep all their stories, because they don't want criticism, which I totally understand. But it doesn't help the larger population to appreciate what's going on. And hopefully my science storytelling can do that a little bit better. So.
Right. Yeah. I know what you mean about definitely how intimidating it is to kind of get into fields and topics that I mean, at least for most people when they were in high school, this was definitely a much more intimidating path. I think STEM has always been a bit more intimidating. And so, I think on a personal level, I was talking to one of my parents today, and then I said, during high school years, I genuinely didn't understand the fuss about biology. It was just so intimidating and scary. And it was often just, it was quite the traditional kind of look at it. And then I got into conservation, and I'm really confused at how I got here. But I think this is also something that Gab Mejia mentioned, was that it's the people, it's the stories that kind of humanize it, and it makes it relatable, and therefore you could kind of, you see yourself and the impact that you're able to make, and how that connects back to the people around you. And so... Right. How do you think the rest of us, as mostly students, right, can play our part into humanizing the science?
I think the first step is, I think Carl Sagan said this, but I can't remember, is basically if you went, I'm paraphrasing, but if you went into a kindergarten, which is for non-US. So if you asked a bunch of 4 or 5-year-olds, everyone would be a scientist. No one is a kid and isn't interested in bugs and nature or stars or something, right? It's it's almost, you're right. It becomes intimidating as we get older because it's hard, or we don't like math, which is a part of science, or chemistry is always the class that I get bad grades in, that.
Yeah.
But I think it's realizing 2 things, but fundamentally one thing. We are all scientists in one way or another. Because science is just a method of thinking and what you do with that thinking, right? But that should both encourage you, because that means that you are a scientist, so you can approach the world in a scientific way. But also, hopefully, that gives you an understanding that scientists are just humans and normal people. And we're moms or brothers or nerds or people that read epic fantasy and brew their own beer, which is me, or someone that brings their 8 kids to soccer practice every day. And it's those are the people that are winning the Nobel Prizes or writing the papers. So I think there shouldn't, I mean, everything about science should be humanized, because all the people doing it, although we seem closed off and pretty extraterrestrial at times, are just humans. We're just a little bit quirky. And everyone else can be part of that community, which is why I like to give talks or do these type of things, because it's breaking down that barrier, which tends to be set up by, systems or academics, when really it doesn't need to be. Like, everyone can find what they love or find their own way in science. And I think that's exciting.
Right. Yeah. And so how did you personally start off? Like, did you always know that you were going to do science or corals? I mean, it's quite intimidating. I think for me, like when we were raised, at least in my area with international schools here, going to university and taking up a STEM subject or taking up biology or even sustainability, it seems very, they don't humanize it. Like, you just picture a laboratory, or you just picture, like looking at like trees and maybe planting seeds. This is a very, very traditional look at it. It doesn't really bring it to life, and let alone make it interesting for people that want a little bit more than that. And so for anyone that's at least flirting with the idea of maybe getting into the sciences or going into research or continuing their studies in this realm, how is that for you, and how would you recommend it to somebody?
I guess I could tell you my story. I need a better answer for this, because I feel like everyone has the majestic, like, I was swimming with dolphins and I was inspired no, I didn't have that shit at all. I mean, I grew up in a super nerdy, but like super supportive family. So reading epic fantasy and sci-fi my whole childhood. My dad was a super nerd. But to be honest, I loved science, but in high school and going into university, I didn't see myself as a scientist. I originally went for psychology, which is a science, but not physical sciences. And I wanted to be a child psychologist. I quickly realized I didn't want to do that. And then here I was 2 years into university. I had done all my hardcore basic sciences. And I was like, man, what am I going to do with my life? And I had a good mentor at the time. And I basically went into his office and I was like, here's what I love. Here's my classes I've taken. What can I do? And he was like, well, why aren't you like a geology or environmental science major? And I was like, I don't know what that is. What is that? Because I'm from like a small town. We didn't have those things. Okay. And I was like, wait, I can go outside and like study shit for a living? And he was like, yeah, like, why aren't you doing that? I'm like, amazing. So I transferred over. And yeah, kind of the rest is history. But I like worked for the government for 5 years. And that was where I started to mature my brain. And I did a whole bunch of different things for the government, all environmentally focused. But it was where I really started to physically see human impacts. Like, because I was working for the Department of Transportation as an environmental protection specialist. They love their names in the US. But essentially, Department of Transportation would build something. It was my job to figure out how it was impacting the environment. So I get to see like what putting a highway, what building a bridge did.
Yeah.
And over the years, I really found that the marine world, so this nexus of where land meets the deep ocean, was where all the impact, where a lot of the impact was happening, because it's physically trickling down from runoff or the land, overfishing, it's all this kickback. So I knew when I went back to school, that was where I wanted to focus. And I knew like, this is the area that I want to be in. These are the reasons I want to study human impacts. I want to study them over a certain period of time because I want to know the context of this influence so that we can figure out how to prevent it, conserve it, restore it. And I spread my net, pun intended, pretty wide and was just like, and there was a guy, shortening it, but there was somebody, Kiho Kim, who was a coral biologist. And he's like, I need somebody with a geology background. And I was like, boom, I'm your dude. And obviously I knew about corals and they're incredible animals and they're a great system to study for those exact questions. But mine was question-based. Like I wasn't, there are some people, especially in biology, who study a animal or a system because they love it. They're like, I love blue tree frogs. Like I want to spend my life studying them. And it's like, cool. I was very much like, I love science. I love asking questions. I love going out in nature. Can I do that for a living? And, you know, I was very privileged to have like grown up in a family that supported that. Thankfully, because we were like really poor. So my parents were like, you do whatever you want. Like you can make that shit work. We are very happy for you and we will support you. And I had a lot of great mentors and just lived by my two codes are work hard and be nice. And I think it gets you pretty far.
It's worked.
Yeah,
so
hopefully.
Far. It's worked so far.
So far, yeah. I'm going to be an asshole for the second half of my life. Watch that. But no, that's a really meandering, absolutely nothing story. But hopefully, to answer your question for others, that shows there is no, that is not a logical track. There is no right way into science, and there is no one way into science. Like I said, I essentially got into science because I read Lord of the Rings. That doesn't even make sense, right? But that's kind of how
I'm going to have to map that out sometime.
You're going to have to map that out, yeah.
I don't really get it, but okay.
Wait a second. It just teaches you to think, use your imagination, which is all science is. We just have to do it professionally. Because I feel like people get to a point in their life and they see others and they're like, oh, I'm already at university and these guys are already in Chem 2 and they're so far ahead of me, I can't possibly do that. What am I going to do? Or you're in high school and it's like, this person's way better at biology than I am. I can't do science. There's, first off, a lot of time and also so many different ways that you can pursue it. That like you don't want to limit yourself. I'm shit at math. I am, but that doesn't
very
mean
encouraging for me.
Yeah, I'm not great at it. Yeah, so but I'm still a scientist because you find your strengths in other ways. So yeah, you need support and you need to believe in yourself. My strategy has been not to be super focused and then find what you're good at and what you love. Some people go right through and they know exactly what they want and it works for them. For me, I was kind of just like, if I hold my arms out wide enough, maybe I'll touch something that I actually enjoy researching.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really encouraging for a lot of people to hear. I think it can get really overwhelming to also begin thinking about. But I think, definitely. It also kind of, just the way that you explained it, though it isn't a story that is, very like see the dolphins and my life flipped, upside down, but you kind of humanized it as well, right? Like those stories are definitely not the only one as well. So I've kind of been a little confused and a little bit scared and unsure what it is it has to offer. But yeah, so I think that kind of humanizing and sharing that kind of narrative also works for a lot of people. And so, yeah, I think just to wrap it up, maybe you could also share what you see would be the future of some of your findings, for instance, like, right. Yeah.
Okay. The future of the future that I see for my findings. Oh no, that was a deep breath. I wasn't cutting you off. I was just prepared.
No, like, with what would be what you think or see the future of, the impact, for instance, of, where reefs are going right now, or because the narrative that we're seeing a lot is that this is basically irreversible and they're all basically dying. And so the narrative is reasonably doomsday type of, it's a doomsday look. And so where can we place kind of hope and support, mostly as consumers and listeners and scrollers on social media, like what can we expect, right?
Yeah, no, that's the question, right? And it's hard because it's very easy to get depressed because I think definitely. most of all of the information that we're taking in, because bad stuff sells, tends to be negative. But all right, I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. Let's take just the work you brought up before as an example. So that the paper I published on the history of Hong Kong's corals, what's incredible about that was that small story was part of this future restoration effort, which is led by a woman, Frico Yu, she's still in my previous lab. She's a good friend. But part of what she did was she used my work to look at Hong Kong and be like, okay, where's the best place if we want to do coral restoration? Okay, it's these areas because there used to be coral here. There's no longer coral here. John found it because he's got all the fossils. And the government has cleaned the water up, so the water's improved. So this is where we're going to do our tests. So that's where she started her experiments. They worked out. So now she's restoring corals to an area, and we called it Inferred Restoration because it was actually using science, right? She knew corals were supposed to be there for my work. She knew that they could survive from her experiments, and she knew that the government was working to clean up the water. So it was like win-win-win, and the corals are doing great. So she prints these 3D tiles, and she's growing corals back where they should be. So there's small stories like that, which are very promising, but on a very small scale. And critics would be like, okay, cool. Well, that doesn't really make that much of a difference for the world. Totally true. Although I would argue that the amount of press that Frico is getting is awesome for corals because it's finally like a positive story.
Right.
And I think that's big. I think changing the language around conservation and the environmental movement should frame the positives as well as the negatives. On a larger scale, I don't want to come across as like too positive. Like there is bad stuff that's happening. Let's keep it to the marine environment. We are overfishing in a lot of different areas. Some fish populations are wiped out. Big, what we call charismatic megafauna or top predators, like we're losing a lot of sharks, and it works its way down the food chain. Reefs, I think in the last 50 years, we've lost almost 50% of the cover of the world's coral reefs. These are real numbers, and these are real things, and they're real bad. And it's going to continue because tomorrow we're not going to change everything. But the reason for hope, which is what I hold on to, because if not, it's like, why am I even doing any of this?
Right.
It comes down to resilience, the term, which basically means the ability of something to bounce back from a bad situation or adversity. And a great example of that is Hong Kong. So hopefully some of your listeners know Hong Kong. But if you looked at this city and then you swam in the water and you realize that there is 8 million people living there and 150 million people right next door in China, you would be like, there is no way shit grows here that is healthy.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. And it shouldn't be in my mind, but it does.
Wow.
And nature is super resilient, right? I mean, we have over 90 species of corals. There's incredible fish biodiversity. I think a third of all species recorded in all of China are found in Hong Kong, marine species. So
that's insane.
Yeah, there's really cool, insane things as well that we need to protect. Now, the only trap we can fall in is if our hope relies on the thing that we are damaging, then we can just always be like, well, it will always bounce back, which is not true. But it should show us that, as we start to make these small and progressive changes, there's a reason for it. Because if we just sit back now, and I think this is a big problem with some of the climate movement where it's like, this problem is too big, we can't solve it. I'm just going to sit back and see what happens. But with conservation and environmentalism, I think there's a very direct change that you can witness. And it's like, because at the end of the day, it's like, if we protect this population, these coral, this species, this animal, these plants, maybe that doesn't make a global change, but we still protected one thing, and you can see that, and you can understand that, like, oh, I made a difference to that. Because imagine if we spun it with people. It's like if you were like,
right,
you're going to give this lecture, and you're only going to influence one person's life. it's not worth your time. You know what? It's like, why? If you could change one person's life, that's a huge deal. We have to approach it in that way. We have to approach it in this more small, what I call like small baby steps. Right. And from a grassroots perspective, I think that's how we have to maintain hope, right? Is that we have to understand that the little things that we do play a bigger role, whether we can see it directly or not. And we need to get that positivity, and we need to get that language, and we need to spread that message, because we're not always going to have the resilience factor or more time. I don't know when that point is, if there is ever a tipping point. But I think we, again, think of the characters, think of the story. Like you want people to understand that they can make a difference, because we can.